Hello and welcome to CMC. I'm Mindy Wright, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees, and I'm also Senior Outreach Coordinator at Ohio State. It's really good to see everybody here today. Today, the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents our public monuments, statues, history, and political correctness. Please help me thank our partners today for today's forum, Columbus Landmarks and the League of Women Voters, Metropolitan Columbus. Recent events have caused us to question the appropriateness of certain markers of histories that are perhaps less reflective of modern sensibilities, like statues of war heroes, ethnic team mascots, or even Columbus Day. Winston Churchill stated it baldly, history is written by the victors, and at the very least, we each see history through our own combination of experience and values, and yet, how can history teach us crucial lessons? Let's invite our experts to weigh in. Won't you please help me welcome sculptor, former provost, and vice president of academic affairs at CCAD, Kevin Conlon. Education Outreach Coordinator at Columbus Landmarks Foundation, Doreen Uhas-Sauer. Associate Professor of History at Ohio State, Hasan Kwame Jeffries. And our host today, journalist at WBNS 10 TV, Jerry Revish. It's all yours.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for being a part of our conversation today. I was thinking about symbols. When the September 11th attacks occurred, there were symbols that were taken down. The Twin Towers, a symbol of financial might of our country. The Pentagon was attacked, our military might. And that third plane that landed in Shanksville, crashed in Shanksville, some say was heading toward the White House. Another big symbol that our country reveres. So they were trying to destroy some symbols there. We think about the Persian Gulf War and the fall of Iraq and the statues of Saddam Hussein coming down. Symbols. So now it's coming back to our country as far as this dialogue about symbols and what they mean to us and what we ought to do with them. After the spontaneous removal of the Confederate statues in cities around the country following Charlottesville, President Trump tweeted this: "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson? So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." And from that tweet and that conversation, we have this conversation today where everybody's got a position. And as we start out today, I just want to get some reflections from each of our panelists today. What was your reaction to the president's comments there on these symbols, these statues, monuments, in jeopardy now? We'll start with Kevin Conlon.
I always like to look at the motive, intentions, and the agenda sort of being driven by comments like that. And it's not as simple as one would think to ask yourself, is this an appropriate representation of our past? It's a decision that needs to be made, I think, by the community, both local and national. But I think that there's been a lot of conversation lately about the idea that, and why we're having this conversation today, I think, is the divisiveness that's being created, the chaos that's being created through comments like that that sort of pit one side against the other. I think we need to look at the motive for that.
Dr. Jeffries.
Well, the historian in me wanted to look at the motive and agenda of those who erected these particular monuments in the first place. We know that it's specifically dealing with Confederate monuments. Most of them were erected not during the Civil War, not immediately after the Civil War, but during the Jim Crow era and in response to the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that says as much about rewriting history than anything that anybody comments on with their fingers today.
Doreen?
Well, fortunately, we're like the three bears up here, and I can say I agree with both of my colleagues. And I can take the position that it really is about both sides. It's about why the monument was there, and then who's using it to their advantage, or for what purposes are they perhaps commenting on it. Is it a distraction? Is this a sincere comment? Is it from someone who's knowledgeable about American history? I kind of lead that for you to also think about. I think that monuments are less about remembering, and they're more about forgetting. And that is part of our problem in trying to deal with the interpretation of them, or what we do with them. And I can understand where it's frustrating for people. However, I guess that's part of what we'll talk about.
So are we rewriting history with this move to remove these statues in some areas of this country, or are we correcting history? How do you all feel about that?
I'm going to jump in here on this one, because I really think that you have to go back and look, as Hasan has said, as to the motivation. Is the statue of Robert E. Lee that was erected for the greater honor of the lost cause many years after the Civil War. And you have to remember, the first actual memoir of the Civil War with any reflection is Ulysses S. Grant on his deathbed, and Jefferson Davis 20 years later. It's not like these things were pouring out into the American press with popularity. They're coming out at another time of extreme heightened segregation in our country, and the ironies just abound. But is that statue so powerful that it couldn't be placed somewhere where the interpretation happens? And you compare it to the monument in Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery, which is actually was erected by a Union soldier, a Union veteran, who had no love for the lost cause, no love for the Confederacy, and what he really wanted to do was just simply to mark that we are Americans, which is why it was a unifying factor, which is why that monument reads Americans, and quite honestly is not an identifiable soldier.
Well, I think we certainly have to take the Confederate monument issue really sort of on its own terms, because it is somewhat unique, in part because of when these monuments were constructed during this Jim Crow era, 1890s to the 1950s, because they weren't benign in their purpose. They were, and they're not celebrations of lost soldiers per se. Right. It's not a surprise that so many of them are to the generals. And I wonder, when our president talks about the generals, which ones he's talking about. To Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and these others, designed and intended to send a very specific and clear message to African Americans that this is about white supremacy, and this is about keeping African Americans in a position of subordination. That was the sole purpose and intent of them, and they were clear about them. Stone Mountain with Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and forgive me, I'm forgetting my Confederate history, Jefferson Davis. How could I forget, right? I try to block it out of my mind. Jefferson Davis. I mean, this was, not only United Daughters of the Confederacy, but the Klan. The rebirth of the Klan happens at the foot of Stone Mountain, and that Stone Mountain, that celebration isn't completed until the 1960s, 1970s. So you talk about when 9/11 and the Twin Towers go down, they are erected at the same time as we're completing Stone Mountain. I mean, that says as much about sort of America, the South, at that particular moment than it does about America in 1865.
Well, I think there's a common thread here, too, with the idea that both in the Jim Crow era and today, there's a certain amount of economic anxiety, racial anxiety, the kinds of political anxieties that are all about change and what is happening. And so, as you look back to the era when these statues were originally constructed and erected, as Hasan said, they were to send a clear message about a certain group of people being in control. And preserving that now, some 50 years later or 60 years later, is again about preserving a certain amount of control. And I think that if you look at some of the vitriol on both sides, frankly, but particularly with those that want to preserve these monuments and leave them unmolested in any way whatsoever, they're about perpetuating that control. And I do think that, it's sort of being driven for political reasons.
You know, we think about a symbol of unification when it comes to racial issues and foment in our country. The mind goes to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So let me ask, what do you think Dr. King would have said about the Confederate flag and Confederate statues? Kwame?
Well, he was actually pretty clear on this topic. I mean, he speaks, in I Have a Dream's most famous, most quoted speech, 1963, from the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, he talks about, sort of Stone Mountain, Georgia, right? I mean, he has a very clear sense that the past is the past, and that what those who were opposing him, who were opposing civil rights, who were opposing extending equality to all Americans, were very much about stopping change. Mm-hmm. The reason, in part, for the motivation behind putting these statues forward, the celebration of the Confederacy then was about preventing change. The reason for the Civil War was about preventing change. And the reason why you're having, I think, I would argue, many people today, or at least those who don't want to accept, don't want the removal of these statues, don't want reinterpretation of these statues and monuments, is that they don't want change, right? And the way we move forward as a society is to embrace change, right? And that's how we've gotten forward. Lord knows I wouldn't be sitting here if the other team won in 1865, right? So in that sense, I'm all for change.
Doreen?
I think part of this also is just that we don't know much about the monuments that are before us. And I don't mean just the Confederate statue. In some states, the erection of the Ten Commandments on the courthouse lawn was fought over as if, forgive me for saying this, but as if God himself had placed them there, from Moses. And people don't realize they came as a result of the movie of Hollywood, the movie The Ten Commandments, where the studios gave away those monuments to be placed on the courthouse lawn. And so they're fighting for essentially a prop from a movie show. Everything has sort of a mixed bag to it. The idea of Columbus, for instance, being whether we get rid of the name of the city or the statue that's, let's take the one at City Hall. It has to be my favorite, and I say that with quotes around it, statue, because any statue that has size 22 shoes is not forgettable. And so if I start tours from there, I don't even have to name him. I just say 22 size shoes, and people know where to gather. That he's named by an early pioneer who actually, here we are right outside the river, was a boatman in Columbus in about 1812. We are the frontier of a second revolution with Great Britain. It's sometimes called the Second American Revolution. And so you looked for those people you could associate with a country that had no history yet as to who you were going to name things for or whatnot. Those of you who go to the Kelton House, very much an icon in Columbus, Fernando Cortez Kelton, the man was from Vermont. This is not, some Spanish legacy here. This quest to have names to show both history as they interpret it at the present and what they hope the future would be is far different than a monument to someone who was purposely or a foreign power inspiring genocide.
Kevin, weigh on this.
Well, I think the idea that we're perpetuating something forever is just kind of foolish. I mean, we all have the agency to sort of write our own histories because it's constantly evolving. I think the harder you cling to something in the past, the more difficult it is for you to adapt in the future. I've seen, many conversations about this idea that you would preserve forever this monument, and even to the point where it's no longer resonating with the audience it was intended to communicate with. And as a sculptor myself, I want to make sure that the work that I create, anyway, is resonating with the audience for whom I create it. I think one good example, not my own, Matt Moore just recently installed his sculpture. He's a professor at CCAD at the Convention Center called As We Are. It's a highly interactive digital sort of selfie, but it has this potential to communicate the really remarkable diversity that we've become here in Columbus. I mean, if you think about it, it's just a remarkable way to sort of talk about the issues of identity, the issues of community, and I think that as a tool for talking about the way things are, that's a much more relevant presentation.
It seems like our country is just kind of rife with a lot of racial tension, and this debate we're having today, or this conversation we're having today, is kind of indicative of that. Recently, we saw the Dove commercial, right? The black female pulling the sweatshirt up, and she becomes a white woman, and I think we didn't see the rest of that, but the white woman pulls that up, and it becomes a Latino, and then pulls it up and it becomes an Asian. I haven't seen the whole ad, but I understand that that's what it was about. What was it about that ad, Kwame, that struck a chord with black people?
Well, look, anytime you have black people turning white, it's going to cause a problem. but there's really a longer history, and it's problematic. There actually is a long history in sort of American sort of corporate culture, particularly in the soap industry. This is what makes this so ridiculous, of selling soap products by demonstrating and showing in newspapers and advertisements how effective these soap products can be by turning black people and black children white. Like, so this wasn't just a one-off thing, right? I mean, this literally is a centuries-old sort of advertisement. And it boggles the mind that you could have somewhere, well, actually it doesn't boggle the mind, but that somewhere in corporate America that somebody says, oh, this is a wonderful idea, right? So either, one, you don't know the history, which is problematic, because...
I think that's a reflection of the lack of diversity on certain corporate boards.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
There's a lack of input from people that need to be saying, that's a stupid idea.
Mm-hmm. And one, it's helpful if you have a diverse board, people of color in this sense, would help. Two, it would help if you know the history, because part of the problem is not only do we not know the history of these monuments in this context, but we also don't know the history of this kind of racialized advertising. But it's also like this, you just shouldn't have to have in the 21st century a black person in the room to raise their hand and be like, excuse me, white people, right? Like, you would think in the 21st century that we would hope to have, we would aspire to have a greater sensibility, that even in a room full of, a corporate board full of white men, one white man would stand up and be like, you know what, we may want to run this by somebody, right? That we're at that point. Unfortunately, it appears that we're not at that point.
Well, and I think we're so ingrained in that. I think about 6 years ago, there was a poll done of 2,500 Americans about what was the Civil War about? Why did the North and the South fight each other? And 2/3 of the white respondents in the 11 states that made up the Confederacy all responded it was states' rights, when clearly Lincoln did not say it was states' rights. James Madison before him had said, you know what, the whole problem with the Constitution is not about small and large states, it's about the North and the South and the racial line that defines them. And, you know, just as the Founding Fathers, bless their hearts, were planning a little time bomb in the Constitution, and it came about within 100 years. We're sort of in that kind of a cycle again. I collect American history textbooks. I know, boring, and but they tend to be from the 19th century and early 20th. And I used to use these with my students. Look up what they said the Civil War was caused by, and they would almost invariably say states' rights, and they would go through the whole thing. And you can take imperialism. You can take any one of the kind of the pressure themes that you're looking for, and you start to realize that generation after generation was taught that same thing. And then we look at education today, where almost all of our textbook market is dominated by the number of schools and kids there are in Texas, and Texas sets the standard for what is taught in our schools. And then we look at state standards, and I just finished chairing the Social Studies Content Advisory for K through 12, and I was reminded again, what is the most controversial period in American history that relates directly to the monuments today is Reconstruction. When is Reconstruction taught? It is taught the last 6 weeks of the 8th grade, when the proficiency test is already over, meaning there will not be one question on it. And then you wonder, would it be any surprise when Americans woke up a couple weeks ago to find that 54% of them didn't realize that Puerto Ricans were also fellow Americans? Would it surprise you at all that there are actually people who believe that Abraham Lincoln was a vampire slayer? I mean, we've got a big bullseye on us in terms of education in so many ways, and it comes back to the whole larger context of these periods of time.
If I could add,
Please.
Jerry, you had asked at the very beginning this question of, are we rewriting history? The irony is, during the Civil War, take the Civil War example, both sides were very clear about what the issue was. The Confederacy, pro-Confederate folk were very clear, like, look, this is about slavery. Alexander Stephens, the cornerstone of slavery.
Documents
Exactly, are making this clear, right? So a revision, a rewriting of history actually takes place afterward, right? Where it becomes that this was the lost cause about states' rights and the like. So when you're talking today about, well, are we rewriting history? No, we're revising it to make sure that we're accurately reporting it. The rewriting has already been done. This has been a process that's been going on, specifically about the Civil War and Reconstruction, for over a century now, of actually trying to get it right, as opposed to memorializing something that is incorrect.
I want to jump in with something that Doreen mentioned, this sort of division between North and South. And part of this comes from a perspective that I have as somebody who was born in Ohio but grew up in Mobile, Alabama. And yes, I have a split personality about that sometimes, but that's a whole nother conversation, so we won't go there just yet. I do think that more than just racial lines, it's economic lines that we're talking about. And I see the stress being created right at the time when the South, speaking of Reconstruction, has begun to rise in a way that has a lot of economic power. And at that very moment that it's beginning to realize its economic power, it's being undercut by things like offshoring and automation that are sort of helping to create a new layer of economic anxiety about their future. And I'm just speculating here, but I think that there's always going to be some sort of tie between the anxiety a particular group feels and how willing they are to sort of dig in their heels to the kinds of change that they face. And I think the economic changes here, in addition to the racial issues and the shifting of the demographics to be a much more diverse place, I think you're seeing that being played out by certain politicians who are willing to pit one group against another for their own political advantage. And that's just my speculation.
No, I would agree. I would only add that the economic anxiety certainly is there, whether you're in Mobile or in Youngstown, but it's also, that cannot be separated from the racial anxiety, both in Youngstown and in Mobile, and how that, in other words, the two are intimately connected, and the two are playing.
And structural, too. I mean,
I
with apologies to my mother, who's probably going to watch this later on YouTube, every time I go to visit Mobile, I can sit down, turn on the nightly news, and see some sort of really unfortunate story about, what's going on in the community with respect to race. And it is every night. It is on the news. There's at least one story that sort of talks about the problem of race. And I'll just leave it at that. But it is part of reinforcing this structural racism that we have here in the U.S.
Well, part of this, too, is it's not just a conversation about America. It really isn't. Since about 1989, I have worked pretty steadily, sometimes several times a year, while I was teaching full-time in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, on international civic education. And there was always interpretations, and a lot with Polish educators. And there was, we hosted Polish graduate students and went to schools and talked about things. And I remember the very first Polish school I was in, a 7th grade class, and there was a problem charged to the students about, oh, your father has promised if your grades come up that you can go, you can go to the zoo, you go to the park, and you can take your very best friend with you. And who would you choose? And the kids said, well, I would take so-and-so. And the father says, no, you can't, because he's a Jew. And here we were, 1990, and the Jew was still being stigmatized in Polish schools. And so they were looking to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights as some guide, because the Constitution hadn't even really been finalized at that point. And so for those people who were more sympathetic, I want to say, there were 2 or 3 schools of thought. The more sympathetic would say, I wish the Jewish population was still here because they were, and they use this word, exotic. A second group of them would say, you know, I am so sorry it happened, but we Jews were victims too. And then the third group, you know, was probably along the more traditional sort of line of thought, kind of almost ignoring it. But once you start, and it took a little while here, once you start referring to other people as exotic or the other, you're already going down that road to perdition as to how you're going to see them as possibly equals. And so in times of ferment and political discord, this is really amazing. So for Jewish people, the wake-up call came when there was actual proof that a small Jewish rural village had been set upon not by Nazis, but by other Polish people who were in effect acting not as de facto agents, but to get in good with that power structure by the burning of everyone in a barn. And from then on, Polish history was never going to be taught the same way again. And so when we come to these things, these moments, I think this is good. I mean, we can't avoid it, and I think the best we can do from it is figure out what we can do. So I want to add one just quick little last piece. So I worked with students in Warsaw, with the Civic Education Center there, and they were teenagers, and they were faced with all those gifts of the Soviet Union, you know, the ones from Stalin and the ones from Lenin and heaven only knows who else. And socialist realism art, I mean, sculpture can be so provocative. And they were all starting to scrap them. This was Saddam Hussein. You know, knock it over, kick it a few times, feel better, walk on. And the students said, no, this is not what you do. What you do is you gather them together, you put them in a park, you have explanation, and you invite artists and new sculptors to come in and give their interpretation of the joys of Stalin next to the statue of Stalin. And that has provided a lot of the guideposts for how this is dealt with in other countries. And I think we can learn from other sources as to how they've dealt with very hard times.
Yeah, I think that the provocation that we are faced with now could be a good learning experience for us to be able to use the conversation as a learning tool. I mean, already it has begun. You just have to sort of manage the expectations of both sides and try to move towards the middle. This country was built on compromise in many ways, and right now I see you know, certain political agendas that are intent on preventing us from finding a way to compromise that would have these sculptures, these monuments, either more informed about what their original purpose was, so that there's some sort of educational text that accompanies them, or they're put in a location where that history is contextualized within a museum. I think there are options here, but you know, to stake your ground and say absolutely no change whatsoever is to deny that the fact that the sands of time are changing everything from under your feet as you speak.
I want to stir the pot up just a little bit here.
Oh, good.
Wouldn't honoring a vanquished foe, like the Confederacy, be the same as honoring the Third Reich? We haven't erected any statues honoring Nazi Germany, have we?
No, but if you go to France and you go to the beaches of Normandy and you go to what is very sacred territory, I think, for World War II, and for veterans who are there, you will note that there is, in fact, a German cemetery. And the German cemetery is small because they weren't given as much land by the Allies, and they all have the same very, I want to say, Teutonic-looking cross on them. It's very dark and very somber, and but the fact is that every year German students, high school and college, will go there to tend the cemetery, and they just do simple maintenance and cleanup. This is not necessarily putting flowers on everything, and they do it because that's how they want to show respect for a loss of life and perhaps a path that many people would not have wanted that country to go down. But they do it out of the respect for the dead, whatever the cause was, which is exactly how Camp Chase comes into being. And yet, it would be easy to interpret that as some other kind of monument, but it's particularly laid very clear. It's just like the birthplace of Hitler was not saved because you run the risk of making the vanquished the martyr. And at that point, that's the lost cause all over again.
But a cemetery is one thing. I think the equivalent wouldn't be a cemetery where you actually have dead who lost their lives in battle. The equivalent would be 70 years after the battle, today, now saying, you know, in front of the courthouse steps, we are going to erect a statue of Adolf Hitler. Right? Like, that's the equivalent of where these Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest statues, the equivalent time frame from the war and the purpose. And also being in public spaces, that's the other thing, right? Like, we all share, as citizens of this country, as residents of this country, sort of the public space. And so, you know, I think cemeteries are great places to put Confederate monuments, right? Just get them out of the public square, that and someplace else, right? Let the dead watch them. But when we're talking about courthouses and public squares, right, that's a different story. That's a different element. You're asking everyone then to either revere or celebrate or even tolerate. And I think that's a different question altogether.
Kevin?
Well, I look at, and I mentioned this earlier in passing, so I'll bring it back around again. You look at the demographic makeup of any given community. So we had some of this controversy as it applied to New Orleans. And New Orleans is a city I know very well. You know, these statues in New Orleans were removed, and it provoked a great deal of angst and concern. But the demographics of New Orleans is that there's a tremendous amount of diversity there, and it was only a very small percentage of the population that was sort of digging in their heels at the idea that these statues would be removed. So I really think that, you know, you have to turn it over to the community to make decisions about what it is that they feel is appropriate for their public spaces.
We were talking about that at the table, and I guess this is an issue that can be legislated. We can't expect the State House or Washington to decide this for us. So who should decide? Should it be the local community, and who within that local community gets a voice?
Well, good luck with legislation. I think getting anything passed these days is going to take a minor miracle. Again, I don't know the answer, but I think that the provocateurs are part of the problem. If you know, reasonable, sane people are willing to get together to talk about what is a solution that both respects and honors the sacrifices that a certain lost cause made, but also is respectful of the fact that, you know, that lost cause was completely inappropriate, wrong, and injured a number of people and should not be glorified. I don't know what the answer to that is, but, you know, the problem is that the conversation is being driven by the extremists on both sides who are trying to advance a particular agenda, usually for political purposes. And I think most Americans, frankly, are not on those polarized sides. They're somewhere in the middle. And I think, you know, if we're smart about this, the provocation that this controversy has created will start waking some people up. I think you're starting to see that in the political sphere, and I'm grateful for it. I don't know whether it will result in any legislation that will, you know, sort of codify the removal of these statues, you know, but I do think that it's good for stimulating a conversation.
I would like to think, and here I have to respectfully disagree, I would like to think that there is sort of an equivalence on the spectrum, but I just don't see it that way. I don't see those who are asking for the removal of these Confederate statues as being equally extreme as those who are insisting that they remain.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I agree. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be interpreted that way, so thank you for clarifying.
All I can say is I remember what happened when students of Nathan Bedford Forest High School, predominantly a black high school in the South, woke up to find that that was the head of the Ku Klux Klan and founder. What that did to that high school when they tried to reevaluate, what do you do with this cherished kind of high school institution named for someone who clearly was being honored at some point and not to be forgotten, and now the population has changed. I believe really this is not a legislative matter, and I also don't believe it's a simple solution. It's not calling a community forum together or even a Columbus Metropolitan Club forum, and then at the end of it we all vote and decide. This is has to be a continuous conversation that goes on, and there is no one possible final solution for all of it, but the conversation itself, the journey, may be more important than the destination on it. Because without memorials, we are sort of like orphans. We're orphans in history. But with a conversation, we at least are humanized orphans in history and can make probably better decisions. And it does come back to education.
Orphans in history. I like
Jerry,
that.
if I could add real quick, you know, while I certainly don't think that our elected officials are going to be the ones who lead the charge in this particular issue, I think it is important to recognize that our elected officials, our public officials, very much have had a hand in the placement, in the funding, in the naming of all of these. So our elected officials very much bear a responsibility for these historic choices. And so I wouldn't want to let them off the hook too easily with coming up with an adequate solution to addressing a problem that they were instrumental in creating in the first place.
We're going to move to your questions here in just a few minutes. So the microphone is right there. We have a gentleman standing, and we want you to get in line there and state your name and your question when we get to that. As I close my portion down, where do we go from here today? We've heard a lot of conversation about the problem, some about what I think you're bringing me as a solution. Where do we go? How do we decide? We're standing in front of the size 22 shoes tomorrow of Christopher Columbus, and we're going to make a statement about whether he stays or goes. What would you say? Doreen.
All I can say is that you'd have to know what we gave Genoa, Italy, to know how strange that was. So perhaps somewhere in Genoa they're going, why do we have that installation, that sculptural installation? As I said before, I think we keep the conversation going. One thing for me about public art and doing interpretation when I work with the Columbus Landmarks Foundation and tours and things, what I do like about public art is that it's not so much that it's commemorative, but that it makes you think, and it's reflective, and it keeps that conversation going. And so I don't see people out there protesting in front of William McKinley's monument in the State House, even though the man at one point infamously said, yes, we should take the Philippines because we have to make them Christian, and they were already Catholic. You know, we have to sometimes pick our battles, but I think this is an important battle, and we keep that education going.
I don't think there is a definitive answer to be had. I love Doreen's idea that, you know, you keep the conversation going. As an educator myself, that's what you do as an educator, is you keep conversations going. And it's through that conversation that you learn more about yourself, you learn more about your place in the community and the community that you live in. I don't think that there's going to be a definitive answer right away. We will evolve to that as long as we stay, you know, cognizant of the fact that certain people are partisans in this and they're trying to drive it a particular way.
Sir?
I think you just got to remove the damn things. Right? Look, this is, if you're going to have, a conversation is fantastic. But the conversation in part has to be driven by facts, right, and education. And I think you know, the decisions that we make based upon the conversations that we have to be driven by historical reality. The society in which we live, the times in which we live, will dictate our sort of political tastes, our sensibilities. You know, there will, I'll make a bold prediction that sometime in the future, we as an American people will sit down and say, you know what, the monuments that we have to slaveholders is problematic. The fact that a Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, had this relationship, and I put that in quotes, with Sally Hemings at age 14, this sexual relationship. We need to think about how we not only memorialize and celebrate this particular person, but we need to think critically about what our celebration says about us as a society in a particular moment in time. We're not at that place. We can't even deal with those who were traitors, right? Let alone the founding fathers, right? So, but I think it is sort of reflective of where we are in society, right? But that conversation that we have to have, that we are having now, that this is a part of, has to be rooted in truth and evidence, and not just sort of in the political extremism of one side or the other, but certainly a side that's not rooted in historical fact.
Yeah, I think that's a given. I would hope that, you know, our conversations would be based in fact and not in alternative histories or fake news or anything else that might be the common term of the day. You know, it is a touchy subject, and there is going to be no quick answer, and you're not going to convert those who are unwilling to be converted, but you do have to have the conversation.
Thank you. Let's go to our questions on the floor. Sir.
Okay. Good afternoon. Great conversation. My name's Todd Kleismith, and I recently saw David McCulloch speak in Ohio. He's one of one of the nation's best-known historians. He frequently laments public ignorance relating to history and speaks on that topic frequently. Anyway, he had a real interesting take on this. I just want to see what the panelists' reaction is to it. He said that I'm less concerned about the monuments that need to come down. Let's talk about the monuments that need to be put up. And I just wanted to get the reaction of our panelists about that comment. Thanks.
Who wants to start?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that's a great point, right? The absence, I mean, we're talking here mainly about sort of slavery and the Confederacy. We have monuments to those who fought to preserve slavery, and very few for those who fought to end it. Not only between 1861 and 1865, but who were enslaved and fought, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, Harriet Tubman, and others, as well as those who gave their lives fighting for the Union, and abolitionists as well. When we get to, again, thinking about where we are as a society, at some point, I would like to think that we as a nation would say, you know what, slavery was a bad thing, yes, but an even greater thing than that is to honor those who fought against it. That even in that moment, we often sort of offer excuses, right, for the people of the past. Well, it was he or she was a man of, or usually a man of his times, right? Like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and these others were men of their times. They were just doing what people did at that time. Well, you know, in 1860, there were 4 million men and women who knew that slavery was wrong, and they were enchained, and they were enslaved. So when we get to a moment in time, I think it will be important that, and I hope we will, erect monuments to those who fought against injustice, who fought against slavery, not just in sort of the immediate civil rights moment where we're doing, but even back then at the founding of the very nation.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club. Is there an opportunity, and I know you made a comment about maybe there is or isn't a role for legislation, but is there an opportunity for communities to create something akin to our historic preservation commissions that would accept applications for removal or addition of public art, public projects, old monuments, whatever, that maybe have outlasted or are inappropriate, and create a process for the community really evaluating this rather than communities seemingly to have knee-jerk reactions from one extreme to the other. It seems to me that this just screams for some sort of organized process where these things could be evaluated on their artistic value, their historic appropriateness, why they were put up, whether they're still valid and as to be put in a museum or to be melted down for something else.
Doreen?
I think that sounds like a question for a sculptor. I have my own opinion, but I'm going to defer on this one.
Well, you know, Columbus has several committees that look at public art, and I think there was an article just recently in the Dispatch about you know, the future of public art in Columbus, but I don't think there's anything that looks specifically at existing statuary. I don't have an answer for you, but I think it's a great idea. It's almost like the question was asked and answered. I'm nodding my head thinking, yes, probably a good idea to at least formalize that conversation in some manner whereby all of the different opinions can, you know, come out on the table, all the facts can be put out on the table, and the evaluation of the aesthetics, that's a little bit trickier because everybody sort of has their own idea about what you know, what is beauty, what is artistic, what is aesthetically valuable. But I do think it's a great idea, so I would support that.
Well, I do think the story behind a lot of our public art is just not known. And I think that helps to illuminate just
Those are the facts.
Those are the facts. What are the voices that actually prompted it?
Right.
You know, to go back to poor William Mckinley, now that I picked on him. I mean, he was, you know, he was a product of a design competition, quite honestly. And his speech that is reflected on that public monument was the last he gave on foreign policy at Buffalo. But I'm more intrigued by the statues that flank him on either side because there's personifications. And just like commemorative art for cemeteries or for fallen soldiers or various times, it goes through various episodes of, you know, what you did in mid-19th century is going to be very different than what you do in early 20th century when it is a little bit more abstract. And I look at those figures and I'm intrigued by, especially, please don't think ill of me for this, I'm intrigued by the blacksmith because he actually is represented quite literally the way a blacksmith would have been. He's naked and he has a leather apron on. And so it's always been fun for me to watch people as they put their arm on his buttocks waiting for a bus. But that's just an aside. What I find fascinating about this is that he was a vaudevillian who played Columbus. And we know that from an old newspaper article. And so when he was here, he took the job of posing as that individual and then took a fee and then went away. And I find that as much as interesting perhaps as a sculpture about the need for vaudevillians to earn a little more money on the side.
Well, there's a long history of memorials that have no personifications in them whatsoever. I think the most obvious example is Maya Lin's memorial to the Vietnam War. And so, you know, we have a wide range of aesthetic considerations for looking at the value of any particular monument. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's not always about the representation of an idea through a person. It's representation of an idea through a variety of means.
I would add only that I think it would be important that before we took the steps to get to that particular committee, which I think is actually a very good idea, that we had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, very much patterned after you know, what took place in South Africa, but it really at sort of local levels, right, community levels, like, okay, what is our role, what is our relationship, and so that we're getting this sort of common set of facts and knowledge, but then also in a very localized way. So not just about what are the facts connected specifically to the creation of this particular piece of public art, but what is the broader context out of which this art sort of emerges.
Let's take our last question.
And so when we look at how we memorialize those that we want to honor, we see cemeteries, we see artwork, it's even evolved to signs on our highways, and I can just imagine that that can even go to different places that we haven't thought about already. In the conversations that you all are involved in, do you believe that the conversation might result in a shift in our societal thinking about what method or process we'll use to memorialize people.
It's an interesting question.
As you were offering your question, which I think is a great question, you know, I thought immediately of sort of Google, right? I guess we all think of Google with everything, right? Information. But sort of Google and their Google Doodles, right? Where they are very far ahead of the curve in terms of who, as a company, as a corporation, Google memorializes, right? Very diverse, both in terms of political thinking, and as well as in terms of representation. You know, we could take a cue from Google, not in terms of elections, but at least in terms of who they memorialize with respect to how it reflects on the society as a whole. So thinking about, I mean, certainly 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought about sort of the internet as a place, the web as a place where we are sort of collectively, publicly celebrating our past. But that is one concrete example of where they are moving in a direction that is much more diverse, much more reflective of the community and sensibilities of the larger public today than it has been in the past.
And the most obvious manifestation of that is, of course, social media. The most recent example I can think of is when the floods hit Houston after the hurricane. There was a terrific image of one of the first responders carrying a woman who in turn was carrying her child. And, you know, I even saw on some of the Facebook or Twitter feeds that somebody ought to make a memorial of that. And, you know, that in itself became a memorial, that particular tweet or that particular Facebook feed. You know, so there are all kinds of ways that we can confirm with one another our values and memorialize them in ways that are less permanent than a cast bronze statue that sits out on the public square for a long time and pisses off a bunch of people.
And in case the little girl on Wall Street disappears, that's how she'll be remembered.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
We're in the hands of our presiding officer now.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. I found it really interesting, not only your ideas, but you guys worked really well together as a conversation. We encourage you to continue the conversation with coffee and cookies in the back. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. So again, let's thank our speakers, Kevin Conlon, Doreen Uhas-Sauer, Hasan Kwame Jeffries, and Jerry Revish. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you here again soon.